your ways to the seats as well. We have a good God, don't we? And he has good things for us. So my name's Stephen, one of the family here at Hope. This morning, I have the pleasure of sharing, is this the final Summer of Psalms preach this summer? So this summer we've been looking at the Psalms and we've been resting, dwelling in the Psalms this summer. And the Psalms are poems, hymns that have been written, were written back throughout the history of Israel. And they've been collated together into this book we call the Psalms. And each psalm has a truth. Each psalm has a characteristic of God, characteristic of man, a characteristic of the relationship between God and man, and it drives that home. And I'd like to say this morning we're looking at the Psalm 1, and I've titled it Make Like a Tree. And that's a summary of what it is. It's to be made like a tree, make like a tree planted by the stream. Now, I chose this psalm because I quite like trees, and I've just realized my top has a tree on it, and it's planted by a stream. So come on. This shirt was designed for this morning. So yeah, I like trees. I spend a lot of time looking at trees, probably more than the average person does. I love the uniqueness of them, how they grow in different ways, how they change over the seasons. Even during the day, they change from the morning sun to the evening, to the midday sun to the evening sun, and even at night they have a different air about them. I think there's something beautiful and mystical almost about them, which really attracts my heart and really helps me connect to God as well. So yeah, I love trees. I enjoy trees. I climb trees when I get the opportunity. But that's not the only reason I chose this psalm. There's a song written by a chap called Graham Kendrick, some of you might know, and the song's called Like a Tree, and it's based all on Psalm 1. It goes, I'm going to try and sing, so forgive me. I am not gifted like you guys at it, but it goes a bit like this. It says, like a tree by the water, I will reach for heaven on high. Here by this stream, my roots travel deep. This river will never run dry. All right. Can't quite hold it, but it was there. That's my attempt, and God told me to do that, and he's funny, and that's why. Okay. So that song, when I sang it, it sounded a bit all right. Well, maybe it didn't. But I first heard that song in an event called The Gathering. The Gathering is when there's a field near Swindon where 1,000+ guys meet together, and it's a gospel weekend. There's songs we sing songs, we have the gospel preach, but we also have Zorb football, axe throwing, and crazy things like that as well. So it's a really fun weekend. But if you imagine 1,000+ blokes in a tent singing a song, and Graham Kendrick's he adjusted it so it's got that sort of the marching band rhythm thing that he's a bit known for. It's quite powerful to hear these guys singing this song. And it stuck with me, that song. And it was a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago now. But it's still a song which I go to like a recalibrator, like a reset button. Like when I notice myself, mind going elsewhere, thoughts going elsewhere, heart going elsewhere, that's a recalibrator. I tune onto either I listen to it or I sing it, and it just helps me to recenter back into God, reaching my roots down into the stream. Right, so let's read Psalm 1 then. Let's read it. So, it reads like this. So, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a pastor, teacher, a man of action, he was based in Germany during the beginning of before the Second World War and into the Second World War, and he was strongly against the Nazi regime. And ultimately, he was then martyred for his beliefs and for standing up against the Nazis. Bonhoeffer reports to have lived in the Psalms. He would have liked our series this summer. And he neatly summarized this Psalm, Psalm 1, along with Psalm 19 and Psalm 119, which has a similar theme, as psalms that lift up and celebrate the law of the Lord. Now, the law of the Lord, the law, whenever I hear that word, it makes me squirm. I don't know, there's part of me that immediately puts up its defenses. To my defense, I reach for words like, we're not under the law, but under grace. I conclude that the notion of meditating on the law can't be relevant to me. Jesus has set us free from that. I mean, that sounds like old covenant stuff, not new covenant stuff. Now, I understand that that's not necessarily good theology, seeing as Jesus himself gives us a commandment, doesn't he? He gives us a new commandment. He says, love one another just as I have loved you, in John 13:34. So I just find it helpful when I get that aversion, that inside sort of monologue or dialogue going, I don't quite agree with this. If I see something like that in God's word, and I have that aversion, it's quite useful to pay attention to that. And on reflection, I think my aversion to that phrase, law of the Lord, is not so much because I believe I'm a man of the grace, even though I very much am and do believe that, but actually, on reflecting, I think it's more coming from a place of, I like to do things my way. I like to trust in my own understanding, and I like to do what's right in my own eyes. That, in effect, is sin nature, isn't it? There seems to be an inbuilt resistance to humbling myself, to follow instruction. And the psalmist here in Psalm 1, and indeed Dietrich Bonhoeffer, clearly believes the law of the Lord to be helpful and even worth celebrating. So naturally, you can see there's some sort of disconnect, a gap in my understanding and experience that needs some work. And it's my prayer this morning that we learn to join in the psalmist in celebrating and delighting in the law of the Lord. So it'd be helpful to try and unpack a little of what is meant by the phrase, the law of the Lord. The Hebrew word is Torah, which is like teachings and instructions. Some of you might know it's the first few books of the Bible is ascribed to being the Torah, like the first books, the Mosaic books, the books written by Moses. Moses was the one who God revealed the law to. It's not just the tablets of stone with the commandments on, but also the 600 plus laws for the Israelites to be the whole goal of that was to be that set apart nation, so that all the surrounding nations would see them and be drawn to them because their God, the Lord of Lords, is with them. So the phrase law of the Lord then evolves throughout Israel's history to encompass God's general teachings and instructions to live. And a definition I found helpful was actually from Bonhoeffer himself. He says, the law of the Lord is the entire salvation act of God and the directions for a new life in obedience to God. And I think I'm not going to put myself up against Bonhoeffer, but I think I can simplify that even more to say the law of the Lord is in effect, it's the way of the Lord. Now, Jesus said something about the way, didn't he? He said he is the way, the truth, and the life. So let's think for a moment, then going back to the psalm, let's think for a moment, what does the psalmist mean by being planted, by being like a planted tree by the stream? I mean, in the most basic sense, a tree that's planted by water is going to do a darn sight better than a tree that's not, a tree that's planted in barren wilderness land with no water. However, in addition to this, I think there's more to it. I think the psalmist, and certainly the Israelites who would have been reading this, would have had in their minds a symbol or a picture of Eden. trees and streams are a nice hyperlink back to the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 2, it reads like this. I'll paraphrase it. But it says, out of the ground, the Lord made to spring up every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. And it goes on to say, a river flowed out of Eden to water the trees, to water the garden, and then reach out to all nations. Eden is a symbol of a very good place. In the Israelite and ancient imagination, the stream would naturally be flowing from the highest point. I mean, water goes downhill, doesn't it? So it would naturally be flowing from the highest point. And in the highest point in their imagination is the point where heaven and earth meet. I mean, we use the phrase up in the heavens, don't we? And so from that highest point, the river flows down and waters the garden, waters those trees that God has caused to spring up. So the trees are being fed, and they're being watered by the highest point from where God dwells and where heaven meets earth. And in essence, the trees are being watered by God. God's energy, God's life flowing through those waters to those trees which are planted by it and being fed by it. So when the psalmist says that a person who meditates on the law day and night is being like a tree planted by the streams of water, that person is receiving life directly from the source of all life. So Jesus showed us how to do this. Jesus showed us the way. Jesus showed us what it was like to live in unity with the Father and only do what he saw the Father doing. And I argue here that the psalmist here in Psalm 1 could easily have just said, but his delight is in the way of Jesus. And on the Jesus, he meditates day and night. It was St. Athanasius who said, Jesus became what we are, that he might make us what he is. So Jesus became what we are, that we, i.e. human, that he might make us what he is. Jesus lived like a tree planted by the water, and he calls us to follow him. So what does that look like in our lives, to live a life meditating on Jesus? Now, I think the psalmist gives us some pointers here in this psalm. So firstly, it's clear. So next slide, please. Firstly, it's clear that there is an alternative. There's a decision, there's a battle, there's resistance going on here. I mean, we look at Galatians, and Paul writing to the church in Galatia in chapter 4, he says, formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to the way of the world. Paul explains that we were slaves to the things that the psalmist mentions here, I think, at the start of the Psalm 1. He says, Paul would say that we were slaves under the control of the wicked, slaves to the way of sinners, slaves in the seat of scoffers. And looking at history, and the history of Israel and God's salvation plan for humanity, if the law did nothing else, it highlighted that humanity seems to be hardwired, hard set on choosing to do things their own way and to do what is right in their own eyes. Now, I have a story from this summer. Our family, we went off to a village just south of Calais, and we got the ferry across there. And our trip to the ferry, to Dover, was an interesting one. We got to Dover, the outskirts of Dover, record time. I was well chuffed, really good. I thought, brilliant, we're on it here. However, as soon as we hit Dover, there was a trouble. There was traffic. I think traffic was so bad. I think we saw reporters there videoing us, and we thought that's not a good sign. That's not. So it took us about 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours to travel 7 miles. That was really hard. Yeah, so that was really difficult. And it's so much we got diverted back on ourselves to then go back the same way we just got. It just seemed crazy, seemed potty. And the temptation in that moment was to buy into a few narratives. One of them is, this is unfair. I deserve better than this. I have the right to break the law and turn down that road which says no entry, because me getting to where I want to get to the ferry on time is more important than the law, and also more important than my rule breaking would affect, how that would affect other people around me. That's one narrative. The other narrative would be, my kids are in the room, to get to that I have the right to be angry at my children for being, why are they so perturbed by being in the car for 3 hours? Well, I have the right to be angry and frustrated at them for being frustrated and angry as well. That's another narrative. The other narrative would be, I have the right to feel envious of my family who are already on the ferry, who somehow managed to miss that traffic. Paul calls us, as followers of Jesus, not to be like that. He says, now that you know God, or are rather known by God, i.e., you know God and his way, how is it that you're turning back to those, I love this, weak and miserable principles? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? It's from the pattern of this world, from the way of the world and the sinners, from the counsel of the wicked and from the seat of scoffers that we have been saved. Paul calls us to have faith in Jesus, calls us to meditate on Jesus and his way. Now, there are a few simple things we can learn from trees, and this psalm teaches us a few things about them. So it's helpful first to notice that a tree is planted. The psalmist doesn't say the tree just so happens to be growing by a stream by chance, but the tree is planted. There's an action, there's an intention behind it, a choice in the matter here. We can choose whether to be planted by the stream or not. And notice also that the planted tree is fairly static and dependent. The psalmist doesn't use an image of a deer that migrates around, finding different pastures, finding fresh water sources, finding new places of safety or new habitation. But he's calling us to be like a tree, dependent on the water source that it's growing next to. So even when the winds come, rains come, and when things look more attractive over there, or struggles come which make us question ourselves, question our choices, and question God himself, we are still called to be like a tree and plant ourselves and stand firm in Jesus. Some of you also might be thinking of Psalm 26, where the shepherd calls the sheep, leads the sheep by the stream. The sheep in that psalm are moving, but the point here is they are being led by the shepherd. They are staying near to their source of life, their source of protection and guidance and safety. Ultimately, we want to be drinking from where God is. And the result of drinking from the source of life is that there's a tree which is pleasing and fruitful. Notice the trees don't tend to eat their own fruit. Trees tend to bring fruit for others to pick and enjoy. So by drawing from the source of life, we can give from our abundance as an overflow, bring our life to those around us. We are an extension of God's bringing life to the world, going back to that God's original plan, back to the Eden imagery of feeding the nations, his life going to all nations. We are an extension of that. That is what he's doing us. That is what church is, bringing his kingdom now. Now, ultimately, to live the way of Jesus is described, to live in a way other than the way of Jesus, in this psalm, is described as being like chaff and perishing. The choice to do what is right in your own eyes and to make life work apart from God is described to be like chaff. When wheat is winnowed, the wheat plant is winnowed, you separate the chaff from the grain, the unhelpful stuff from the helpful stuff. Chaff is empty. It's lacking in substance or nutrition. It isn't good for food. Winnowing includes the process of taking the wheat plant, tossing it into the air, and the wheat plant separates. And the chaff separates and gets driven away by the wind because it's lighter, and the grain falls back down onto the sieve to be collected. Chaff is driven away, leaving behind the grain. Now, living away from the stream and apart from that source of life is like being blown this way and that, and ultimately lacking fruit. Also notice the psalmist says that the life apart from God, those people will perish. Now, perish, the Hebrew word here for perish doesn't mean just to die, bosh, that's it. But there's a process to it. It describes a process, describes a withering almost, like a wandering away, almost being lost, without any sustenance, without your lifeline, as it were. And that then eventually leads to death. So a life apart from God, apart from Jesus, apart from the stream, is one who is separating yourself from the source of life, your lifeline. And disconnection from that ultimately leads to death. And that death can look like death of relationships, death of your spirit, your heart, your mind, your will, and ultimately death of your body. Clearly, when we step away from God, step away from the stream, that's not how we're designed to be. And then we falter, and we're weakened as a result. And I think this psalm is a warning as well. Now, going back to my Dover experience, my feelings of anger and frustration at the other road users and at passport control, and my resentment and envy towards my family who are already on the ferry. Now, if I had left those feelings unchecked, those beliefs unchecked, allowed them to ruminate, or to use the expression the psalmist uses here. Notice the first verses. It describes a bit of a progression. It goes from walking to standing, and then to sitting. Progressively, those conditions are more difficult to get out of. If I'm walking in the wrong way, I could quite easily turn away and go back the other way. Quite easily, I say, but it's more easy to turn away out of that way. If I'm standing, I need to go over the initial inertia to get me going again. If I'm sitting, I'm getting old now. Standing up from sitting is much more difficult. So if I had slowed down from a walk to standing and then to sitting in those thoughts and those sort of self-entitlements, those feelings could as easily have been exposed me. It could have resulted in bad things. And the expression is gaslit, isn't it? So fuel could have easily just been thrown onto that, and I could have just gone poof and out of control. Could have spiraled into unhealthy, unfruitful impacts on my relationships and on those around me, and also my relationship, especially with God himself. And 1 Peter 5 talks, hence why I've got a picture of a lion up there prowling. 1 Peter 5 talks about the enemy prowling like a lion, waiting to devour. Notice that lions pick off the undernourished, the weaker. And in John's Gospel, chapter 10, Jesus warns us that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus is wanting us to be planted by the stream, to live lives like Jesus lived, to have our roots deeply rooted into the stream, to receive from the Father by the Spirit, so that we are not found to be undernourished, but deeply rooted in the source of life. So when strife comes, when struggles come, when the enemy comes, when traffic comes, an enemy comes prowling like a lion, wishing to devour us, wishing to lure us away from God, to heap guilt, condemnation upon us, to draw us further away from the truth. the enemy isn't able to because we are rooted and protected. We are rooted and protected. Now, we eventually got back to got to the family home, got to the holiday home that we were all meeting in the south of Calais. And I'd love to say that as I stepped through the door, all was well. However, that wouldn't be true. Despite me processing on the ferry, I had time to process that what had just happened, and it seemed huge at the time. Looking back, it seems a bit trivial, but it seemed big at the time, and as they often, as things do when you're in the thick of it. I was able to deal with that. I had a nice pie, I had coffee, so that was good. My body felt nourished, it wasn't hungry. I was tired, that's for sure, but I still felt frustration and a sense of injustice, and I couldn't have actually put words in it at the time, but I felt envy towards my family, because they didn't go through the same experience we did. And actually, a good test for this is when I got to the home, and I looked through got to the home, and I looked through the window, because there was an indoor swimming pool at this place. It was amazing. But we walked through the house. We got through the house, saw the window which was looking over to the indoor swimming pool, and I saw the kids, my nephews and nieces, having fun in the pool. I didn't look at them and think, oh, that's great. Look how much fun they're having. Isn't that beautiful? My thought was, why are they already in the pool? They should have waited for us. And it's that's good to pay attention to those things. Good to pay attention to that. And so I noticed that. I noticed that feeling. I didn't like the ugliness that portrayed. And I didn't like that feeling. And clearly that self-entitlement that I was feeling there. Now, my brother turned up and he said, "You look like you need a beer." And true, that would have been nice. But I said, no, I don't think beer is the answer at this point. I probably don't want any beer just yet. I need to process stuff. And so, I did. I took some time to process it, and God didn't answer immediately, but He did. But a few hours later, it was brilliant. So I was putting the kids to bed. I was reading Lucy and her and my niece a bedtime story. It was a really simple story about a brother and sister who was a special treat each Saturday morning. They get to go to the shops and choose a sweet, or choose something sweet, to buy it, and the dad will buy it for them and take them back home, and they can enjoy their sweet that they got. Now, the daughter bought a cake, and she took it home and ate it, and it was gone fairly quickly. But her brother bought a lollipop, a big lollipop, which lasted much longer. And so he was still there licking his lollipop, barely touched it, whilst the daughter was there with her cake all gone. All she had was the crumbs on her face. As the morning went on, the sister kept looking at her brother, licking his lollipop while she had nothing, feeling envy towards him. She was a bit mean to him. He asked, "Do you want to go out and play?" And she said, "No, I don't want to play." And then eventually, while she was outside playing, she sat herself nice and close to the lollipop and eventually took a lick of the lollipop and put it back down. She then took herself away and was grumpy for the rest of the day until her father stepped into the room and saw her and looked upon her and said, "What's wrong?" And then she explained the situation. And she gave her dad a big hug, went out to see it to her brother, said sorry for being mean, sorry for licking the lollipop. And all was well. Now, it's hilarious because I didn't know Lucy had packed that book. I think I've only read that book once. And I was there reading that book. And as I was reading it, I just laughed out loud because only God can orchestrate that. I mean, it's just such goodness. He's just so exposing, isn't he? It's just so exposing, but in a good way, in a gentle way. Not that I didn't feel naked and exposed and like afraid. I felt seen, I guess. And I felt that he knew me and that he wanted me to be in a better place than where I was. It highlighted that this little children's book highlighted to me the lie that I was leaning on. And it helped me to see and to reach out for God, to lean towards his way. I mean, there's no space for envy in God's kingdom. And at once that was highlighted to me, I was able to address it. I said sorry to God. I took myself away once doing the kids' bed. I took myself into the room and I leaned into him and I crucified my feelings of envy and resentment. And I chose to draw on the stream of living water instead. And I'm happy to say when I walked downstairs and joined everyone else downstairs, that a veil had been lifted, that veil of fog, that veil of sort of just not being right was lifted. And I was able to see them, to be present with them, and to love them, free from that resentment and the envy. Jesus is wanting us to stay rooted in him, to draw on the power of God himself to sustain us. He knows the world we're living in, and he teaches us how to draw from the stream of living water if we let him, if we invite him. So let's make like a tree planted by the stream. Let's delight in Jesus and meditate on his ways. Choose to stay rooted into the source of life. If I invite the band up, I'd just like us a time of, a time of response, just to not rush on from here. Let's, whatever's comfortable for you, closing your eyes, hands together, however you feel comfortable. Let's just receive from God and just go to God for a moment as we sit here and reflect on his word. Jesus, you want good for us. You don't want us to be planted elsewhere. So Lord, in this moment, come. In your gentle way, not a way of condemnation or anger as such, draw to us and lead our minds, lead us into where is it? Is there any spaces in us? Is there any relationships, any mindsets, any things where we are choosing to stand or walk or sit in the way of sinners, in that way, that miserable way? Lord, you want good for us, and you have good things. So help us to be trees planted by the stream, whose leaves do not wither, whose leaves shine different colors in different seasons and in different times of day. We are uniquely made. And help us bring your kingdom. Help us bear fruit so that we can nourish and bring your goodness to those around us. In Jesus' name we ask this. Amen.